All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today at Secular AZ. We are a 501c3 organization focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state for over a decade. We have great programming. We just wrapped up the final in a series of school board candidate forums that allowed our members and other folks to just be able to see who's running in their districts, because, you know, school boards really are the heart of our democracy. We're going to be shifting gears, though, and next Wednesday on 9/28, we are going to have a forum for the Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction candidates at 6 o'clock. That'll be followed, I believe, the next week with the treasurer, then Secretary of State, and probably a lot of us saw the debate last night, if you can even call it that. And so there's very stark contrast between some of the folks who are running in the state of Arizona. If you want to learn more about them, please make sure that you sign up for our newsletter, action alerts, and get on our mailing list so you don't miss out on some of the great programming. Next Friday, our guest is Uncage and Reunite Families Coalition, and they are going to be discussing the illegal treatment of children and families at the border, including forced abandonment of religious items. And as Lindsay has put it up on the screen, you can see there's many more. The Fixing the Framers' Failures is a fantastic series that's being put on in partnership with the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix. If you want to learn more about the Constitution, Bob McWhorter is giving us a fantastic presentation on the founding fathers and the mistakes that they made. So if there is anybody that you would like to see on our program, please reach out to us, info@secularaz.org. But today, I'm really excited to hear from today's speaker. Dr. William Horne, he goes by Will, is a teacher, writer, speaker, editor, and historian of racial capitalism and Black liberation. He is the co-founder and editor of the Activist History Review and an Arthur J. Ennis Postdoctoral Fellow at Villanova University. His research focuses on how elites and white supremacists use the state to recreate racial inequality. So I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm sure that Lindsay will put the link to your latest article that I didn't have a chance to finish, but I'll get to it after this, and I'm sure I'll learn more about it today. So without any further ado, Will, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to speak about.
Hey, yeah, thank you all so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is really where the work of maintaining our democracy happens, and so I feel privileged to join you in that labor. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. That's okay with everyone. I have some visuals that I think might help us kind of make sense of what we're going to be talking about today. And sorry, go up all the way to the top here, and the idea behind this really, it's not anything super formal. This is a little bit like maybe what we might do in class. And so what I have for us today, and I hope we can talk about it afterwards, is just some, what we call as historians or as teachers, primary resources. And so what this means is that, we're going to be looking at, a few examples from history of laws and practices tied to Christianity, particularly sort of the white evangelical fundamentalist Christianity that produce and maintain white supremacy in the state. And so a little bit about me, and I don't know if you can see all of Rose Parks here, but with the Zoom. But I study the relationship between white supremacy and Black liberation. There's lots of ways to describe that, but that's basically what my work is and what it does. And so in many respects, I see Christianity as both an instrument of liberation, particularly in the sort of long Black freedom movement in the US, one that is ongoing. But I also see it and research it a great deal as an instrument of oppression. And so I think it's important for us to to note that it plays both roles in the US, but then also to think about like why it plays both roles and what we can do about that, right? And I don't know if any of you follow me on Twitter, but I shared this poster from Rosa Parks's one of her events from 1956 in Baltimore. And one of my favorite things about it, just down here at the bottom left, not only is it advertising Rosa Parks, who was by then, even in 1956, a living legend, but it also advertises good music. And I think that's really, I don't know, encouraging and heartening, fun, all of those things, because it reminds me, and maybe it reminds you too. I grew up in New Orleans, going to Mardi Gras parades and all of those things, and there's an element of celebration that goes along with liberation, and I think that's really important. So, without further ado, here we go. There's one or two sort of big picture questions I want us to consider as we're discussing today. And really broadly, I guess what I'm asking is sort of like, what has fundamentalist and nationalist Christianity done in the US? Like, what is its track record, right? For those of us who live here, and what role has it served in our society? And so that sort of is the question I want us to engage a little bit today, and I think maybe informs why we have this movement today, the Christian nationalist movement in the Republican Party that is geared towards a particular type of nostalgia, one that is dangerous, and one that in some ways kind of celebrates some of the nasty things we're going to be looking at a little bit today. And so the first resource I want us to use is the legislatures. And so like even before the US was a country, right, we had legislatures, and these legislatures in various colonies passed laws that created race, that created whiteness, we would come to call it whiteness, but created really an idea of racial hierarchy, written into our very earliest laws, and something that is, maintained not only through, explicit laws, but through practices, through the present. And so this is something I want us to think about. And so I have here a collection of laws that was put together by PBS. This is just a screenshot, but I think gives a sense of some of what these laws entail. And there's a few things I want to point to here that I think are really important. The first is in this very first law from 1639. We have here, what would eventually sort of morph into to the Second Amendment. We have here laws that say not only, are, citizens, subjects, colonists sort of required to have guns, for various reasons, but, there are groups, right, Black Americans who cannot, right? And there's very clear reasons for that, if we think back into the sort of the laws and practices that governed slavery. The colonists and these legislatures are very concerned with the prospect of a revolt among, working class and especially enslaved people. But I think the other laws here are really interesting, particularly in the way that they play upon Christianity to create what we would, come to call race. And so the first of these, this Maryland 1664 law, the idea here is that, the children of people who are, mixed race, these people must also somehow be enslaved. We have a sort of a similar logic here, in the very next law. But I think really the last one is very telling in that, there's a whole spectrum of people who lie outside of Christianity for these early colonists. And any of those people, according to the logic of these colonial legislatures, can be enslaved at any time, really. And that slavery can be justified. The third law, and we'll move on, but like the third law, I think is also really interesting and illustrates an important point. Like enslaved people are paying attention to how people are talking about these laws. They are, themselves sort of trying to figure out how this system works. And enslaved people actually do petition for freedom. based on the fact that they are baptized. And some of them win these freedom suits, right? And so, in Virginia in 1667, enslavers start, getting upset and realizing like, there is this loophole in the law, where we say, hey, we can enslave anyone who's not Christian, but what if they become Christian, right? And so this is really, many scholars point to this as sort of like one of the origin points of what we would call race, right? Like that there's a sort of a, I don't know, a civilizational, or, race is really the word, right? There's this attributes that somehow, if your parents were, enslaved and not Christian at some point, then you, by that logic, right, can also be enslaved for the same reason. Not super consistent, but very useful and exploitive for enslavers. Again, like we could go through a bunch of these. I just pulled out a few that I thought were, particularly telling. We've sort of already discussed this, but again, there's a whole group of people here that lie, from the perspective of Virginia enslavers in the General Assembly, outside of the bounds of, civic rights. Again, here we have, sort of laws now growing out of this idea that there shouldn't be, some kind of uncertain status relative to Christianity, relative to race. And so we have instructions here that the Church of England, the church, which is like the established church of the colony, can't perform marriages, for interracial couples. And so again, the idea is that like the church is sort of wrapped up in these practices, not only, in the sort of the logic of creating in justifying slavery, but also, in maintaining it, right? Like maintaining a sort of a segregated society, although like one, of course, in which enslavers are surveilling, right, and exploiting enslaved people. John Calhoun, famous senator from South Carolina, echoes this idea in 1837. With what he calls this sort of civilization argument. He calls slavery, quote unquote, positive good. And there's a very similar logic here. It's arguing that like slavery must be great because, look at all of the great things that enslavers get out of slavery, right? And so notes, although like he's arguing that African descendant people, that they are, benefiting in some way, this is pretty clearly from the perspective of enslaved people, not the case. And so I have a few examples from what we call ex-slave narratives, interviews of formerly enslaved people that give us a sense of how slavery was practiced and experienced before emancipation. This one is gruesome, and I apologize for that. I try to sort of cut out maybe some of the most grisly details, but I think illustrates, the extent to which this regime of torture depended upon the ability to torture anyone at any moment. A regime which, again, paints itself as devout, as Christian, as civilized. And so Rebecca Fletcher remembered that enslavers would, or overseers would, at their behest, dig a hole and put enslaved women's, bellies into it if they were pregnant, so that they could still beat them, so they could still exercise violence, right? And there's there's a lot of accounts that say essentially this, and I think one of the things that's really jarring is there's a testimony from someone whose mother died, while she sort of went into premature labor during one of these experiences. But you get a sense, I think, of the brutality of this regime. It is obviously not one that benefits, pregnant enslaved women, or anyone for that matter who was enslaved. Another example here, which sort of calls into question the devotion, let's say, of the enslaving class, is what religious practices they allowed. And Elizabeth Ross Height, among other things, a very interesting woman, recalled that that she wasn't allowed to pray or sing or do those sorts of things, just constantly surveilled, right, by enslavers and overseers. And enslavers are worried, in fact, that if enslaved people are allowed to sing, practice their faith, those sorts of things, that they will revolt, that they will rise up, against, enslavers and overthrow them. And so this is, in part, although the law is now guaranteed slavery, this is in some ways, I think, a legacy of those Virginia laws that we were looking at earlier, kind of regulating that practice. Carlisle Stewart, again, has perhaps an even more jarring experience in that, like, he argues that enslaved people, per his experience, really couldn't practice any kind of religion at all. And, this is one of the interesting things, again, if we sort of go back to the argument that, like, slavery is somehow designed to promote Christianity. This is the logic that, it's very founding, that enslavers used to justify enslavement. And if you, look at what actually happened, they're very reluctant to allow enslaved people to pray, to sing, to hear preaching of any kind. And part of that is a concern for, as we've already mentioned, potential enslaved, revolts by enslaved people. A concern that treating someone with any kind of dignity at all, right, like gives them some kind of hope for a better future and a means to access it. But it's also simply a labor issue. Like these people claim to did own, right, other people to profit off of them, and so the most common experiences of enslavement that you hear from these ex-slave narratives, these interviews, are of being worked from dawn to dusk, it being beaten, if they didn't work fast enough, right, or produce enough, if they were not profitable enough to their enslavers. And this is, I think, really, it's a profit system. It's a system of profit and power. And so, in some ways, although if we believe enslavers, right, it might be surprising that they didn't, allow enslaved people to practice, their faith in any way, shape, or form. If we really, think carefully about it, I mean, it fits with the pattern and the logic of enslavement. And so, I guess the question that I raise here, I have a few reflection questions throughout that I, hope will produce some good conversation later. But the reflection question is essentially like, why Christianity? Why do legislators use that as a tool? That simply sort of like that it is already available as a system of power? Is it, the sort of the divine, unimpeachable authority? Is it like the biblical references to slavery? Like, what is it exactly about Christianity that makes it such a useful tool for legislatures during the colonial and then national, eras in the U.S.? I want to shift gears a little bit, and follow two what I would call backlash movements, essentially. I mean, so the first of these is during Jim Crow, the advent of Jim Crow in the 1880s, 1890s. And this is a backlash movement that occurs during the wake of emancipation. And beginning in 1868, on a pretty broad national scale, Black Americans are able to vote. And this kind of like throws, the national consciousness, like what it means to be a citizen, into a bit of disarray for many white Americans, not just white Southerners, although that's like how we remember it, right? But like the white North, like had a whole army, in the South, and still sort of like acquiesced to this rising white supremacist violence and the changing of laws and those sorts of things. And so I think we have to take that into account as well. But the reason that there is a backlash in the first place is in some respects because of the success of Black organizing, Black military service during the Civil War, Black petitioning, and those sorts of things that create Black emancipation and that create Black enfranchisement. And so we have here then in the 1880s and 1890s, after a decade of Reconstruction and redemption, quote unquote redemption violence, an attempt to create a new regime, what we would call Jim Crow today. And one of the key things that I think is really important here, and I meant to mention that with the card right here, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, is that they are an example of an explicitly Christian organization that is not only like complicit in the operation of Jim Crow, but sort of is actively promoting lynching, racial terror, those sorts of things, in order to achieve their own sort of political agenda, a bid for political power, if you will. Frances Willard, who was the Women's Christian Temperance Union president for quite a long time, argued that in 1890 that Black Americans were essentially a scourge on the U.S. And she makes this biblical comparison, compares them to the locusts of Egypt. This is horrible, but she says it actually, during the Advent, at the very beginning of what would become sort of like what we know today now is the lynching movement. This really is a movement that, although there had been lynching prior to the 1890s, it really just explodes, in terms of scope. It truly is a national movement by 1890. And so in some respects, Willard is actually sort of responding to the advent of lynching as a national phenomenon, and seems, in fact, to be encouraging it. Another sort of famous example, also a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, is Rebecca Latimer Felton. And she, again, very explicitly promotes lynching, and argues, that lynching is important to protect virtue, and to promote virtue. And of course, we know from studies of lynching that it does nothing of the sort. That it often targeted Black workers who were simply asking for their wages, maybe targeted Black property owners who, white neighbors were sort of eyeing their property, right, and wanting to have access to that, right? There's very little basis for these kinds of charges that Felton and Willard are making, but they're very effective, dangerously effective. I also want to note, and again, I don't know how visible this is, so I apologize if it's not, but I left the caption from the Felton image here because I think it's illustrates the tactic and why they use this tactic. Felton she's senator for a day in Georgia, so she sort of has this mantle because of her work for women's suffrage. Has this honor as being the first woman senator. But what Felton, what Willard, what others in the Women's Christian Temperance Union and other related, and there's many other organizations, and just sort of random preachers and people like that. But what they create is really what I think we should call a lynchocracy. They create an environment of racist hysteria, and then use that racist hysteria in order to wage violence and seize property and power. And so this is a very famous image that led directly to the Wilmington coup and massacre in 1898. And we see here, obviously, like a racist, denigrating image of Black men, but notice they're standing on a ballot box as if, and it looks even perhaps like they're sort of coming out of the ballot box, right? And it's worth noting too here that the name of the ballot box is the Fusion ballot box. And what the Fusion Party was in North Carolina in the late 1890s was an interracial organization. It was a sort of a class-based multiracial party that white supremacists targeted explicitly because it brought Black office holders to office. It's also worth noting that the Wilmington coup was sort of publicly discussed in the white supremacist press in North Carolina, and they of course produced this political cartoon But they're very open about, their goal to bring guns to the ballot box and those sorts of things. And after they actually sort of intimidate all of their political opponents away from voting, and they win the next election, they decide even that's not enough, right? And they do actually then orchestrate and carry out a massacre and a coup, one that they drew upon the National Guard to help them with. And so the National Guard, opens fire on Black Wilmingtonians alongside these white vigilantes. But again, these people are discussing it in public, and they're using this sort of racist language from the white, Christian evangelical movements to their advantage, and to wield extraordinary violence to gain property and to gain power. This also leads to the advent of, again, a fairly widespread lynch culture, one that was not just relegated to the South, and I'll show you a map in a moment. But it's also one that celebrates this racist violence as something that's good, very much reminiscent in those terms of the Calhoun speech that we looked at a moment ago. And Calhoun, of course, remember, called slavery a positive good. And no, like they're writing little notes about their experiences at the lynching. I cut out the image, which would be like on the reverse side of the postcard, of the lynching victim. But you can see here the faces of the lynch mobbers themselves. And if you look, they're in their Sunday best. They appear to, they have their kids out. They appear to be celebrating the lynching that they just enacted. Have another one here. And again, I cut out the lynching victim. But if you look here again, we have a very similar view of what sort of the aftermath, the environment of a lynching looks like. These often took place either at a courthouse or at a church, or very nearby one of those. And so there's a claim to legitimacy there. There's a claim to sort of like a state sanction, but I think also, especially with the role that preachers played in this, and they sometimes sort of like ask for a public confession. Sometimes they talk about demonic influences and stuff in the lead up to a lynching. They really do play an active role, and it appears to be, in many cases, a church-sanctioned activity, as well as a state-sanctioned one, state-approved one. And so, again, what we have here, is a white evangelical Christianity of the 1890s, early 1900s, that is, I think, not only complicit, but actually sort of actively encouraging these acts of racist violence, acts that reverberated throughout these communities, and really did instill a sense of racial terror among Black residents. And here's the map I mentioned earlier. And again, here you can see sort of the scope of lynching. It really is a national phenomenon. We have lynching victims, all the way up in the Great Lakes region, right? Urban areas, rural areas, really all over the map here. And you'll also notice too, and it looks like it's visible here, we have actually different racial groups who are targeted for lynching. But again, under the same framework. And this is really important to keep in mind, is that Christianity, as opposed to like a limited theory of race, Christianity is malleable to such an extent that it allows local lynchers to pursue lynching of, let's say, victims who are not Black, but who are perhaps, indigenous or, Chinese migrants for their own reasons, right? Really the same reasons that Black victims are lynched in the Deep South or in urban areas. But again, for access to property, for access to power, to suppress wages, This is really sort of the goal of this movement. And it does, I think, lynchocracy is a fair term for what we have on our hands here. And so again, I have a reflection question
here. If I can ask you real quickly, because
yeah, of course.
On the screen it's cut off. If you could go back a slide.
Yeah.
The lower two kind of demographic, the colors that you had designated for the various demographics. What is the like mustard yellow color and the like I don't know, mauve color?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me sorry, trying to zoom in here. No, it's not working. All right. So it's Latino and Indigenous, Native American.
Okay.
And then we have
All
Italian on the right and right. Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
It's a good question though. Yeah. And so the reflection question again, and I, maybe if sort of pointing to a potential answer here, but like, why does Christianity offer, and particularly fundamentalist or evangelical Christianity, offer an avenue for racist mass violence? We can see clearly in the way that these lynchings unfold, the goals of the lynchers themselves. They often, again, are either like trying to prevent union organizing, like in the Elaine massacre, or they are, trying to prevent Black workers from collecting their wages, like in the Sam Hose lynching, which is a very famous lynching in Georgia. So we know kind of what they are trying to do. Why does Christianity provide the vehicle for that? And then sort of the last of these sort of backlash movements that I want to look at, and the one that I think is closest to the one that we are confronting today, is this post-Brown backlash movement. The Brown era backlash movement actually sort of revives a lot of the tactics, a lot of the sort of like literal spaces, the flags and banners and things like that of the previous backlash movements that were sort of on the front end of establishing Jim Crow through racial terror, mass violence, and those sorts of things. And again here, like I think some of these images are very telling. And so in this section in particular, like I really primarily just have images here because I think these feel disturbingly relevant, and we maybe can talk about why. And so here we have an image indicating both that this church is the key, I guess, to this community, but then also like some people are simply not welcome, right? Like Black residents, they don't need to bother showing up to this church, right? And this is very much a response to Brown. We have another very similar image from Nashville. And if you can kind of make out in the background there, the sign that one of these segregationists is carrying says, "God is the author of segregation." Another image from Nashville. Communists apparently have been going to church, which is surprising, but is what it is. And now, the communists are coming for our schools, which again, should feel relevant and deeply disturbing, given what we're seeing today. Here we have the famous protest in Little Rock. And once again, we have in the background like race mixing is communism, but then also, and I know this is cut off a little bit, but that race mixing, I guess integration, we're integrating a school here. Integration is like apparently the march of the Antichrist. So very, explicitly apocalyptic millenarian references here. It's clear that this is both a religious movement and a white supremacist movement, or a white supremacist religious movement, really, right? This is another sort of famous one from New Orleans, and again, a sort of a reference to the Bible as justifying or founding segregation. And so we have that here, both in the cursed is the man who integrates, but then also like the sign behind it, like this is apparently God's way. I guess the woman to the left is sort of confused about interracial sex, and what happens there. I'm not sure. She's going to need to. It's just a question mark. I need to give it more of an explanation for that sign, I think. Here we have a Memphis protest and actually a counter protest. And so we have Black protesters on the right, protesting the segregationists on the, or Black protesters on the left, you know, sort of going toe to toe, I suppose, with the segregationist protesters on the right. And in the middle here, we have a child carrying this sign, "The Lord made us different for a reason." Right. Interesting. Again, in support of segregation. Oh, and oh gosh, this one from Harrisburg in 2021. How did that get in there? And again, you know, very similar rhetoric with Marxism, communism, indoctrination, and references to God. You know, in God we trust here, sort of to the right. What does this sort of have to do with Marxism? Interesting. Yeah. And so the reflection question here, I guess, I have one sort of on the fly, which is like, if these communists are everywhere, like, why haven't we done the communism yet? What's going on here, right? Apparently, like, this is both a ubiquitous threat and something that apparently doesn't have much of an impact. But, you know, more broadly, again, like, why is there sort of a return to this particularly sort of militant, propertied version of Christianity to promote segregation in the aftermath of the Brown ruling? What makes Christianity the vehicle for that? I want to turn a little bit more to the present as I'm wrapping up. And I want to pose this question that, again, is sort of raised by the Calhoun excerpt, but also by Black radical thinkers from Du Bois through Aimé Césaire and the thinkers of the civil rights movement, which is like, what are we doing here? We're calling this civilization, and we're like, actually, you know, it's white Christians are like meting out mass torment, right? You know, and so is this really civilization? I guess is sort of the question that they pose here. And so it's no accident, I think, that we see a very similar movement to what we saw, you know, post Brown, tactically. I mean, and a very similar movement tactically to what we saw, you know, during the 1890s that sort of entrenched what would come to be called Jim Crow. There's a reason for this, right? And it has to do both with this ideology, but also with the tactics that these ideologues have found successful. It's worth pointing out, I think they're aware of the history. This isn't a history that they're unaware of. It's a history that they're actively, literally weaponizing. And so we had in the 1920s, you know, a very active paramilitary movement to help shore up Jim Crow, one that saw the launch of the second Klan in the wake of the Birth of a Nation movie. Like literally a response. That's where the white robes come from. That's where the cross burning comes from. It comes from the movie. It doesn't come from the first Klan of the 1860s. And again, very public marches. Like, we have Klan members holding American flags, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. Their language is also like explicitly that of evangelical Christianity, which again, I think is something to consider. They also use the slogan, America First. And then we have, you know, I think sort of an echo of that very tactic. These are both images from the January 6th attack in the Capitol, very clearly tying Christianity to white paramilitary violence. We also have sort of battles over iconography. And so, you know, if you saw sort of some of the protest images from the summer of 2020, some of them actually were at this statue. It's a very famous statue, and the first one to go up on what would be called Monument Avenue in Richmond. And this is the dedication ceremony. So it was dedicated in 1890 at the beginning of this sort of wave onslaught of white supremacist violence. And, you know, it has been sort of rededicated, you know, during the 1950s and 1960s as the sort of the post-Brown people are looking to the enslaving South for sort of precedents, right? And then we see that again today, right? Like there are like literal skirmishes around these statues, like Charlottesville comes to mind, right? We also have, of course, the book bans. We have the anti-trans legislation. We have the abortion laws, all tied up in this same, white evangelical Christianity in a very particular worldview, that a very particular vision of the future, I guess is a better way to put it, wrapped up in that. And so I raised this question a moment ago at the beginning of this section, but I think it's worth revisiting here. Aimé Césaire, in his famous discourse on colonialism, sort of makes this point that Europe, and I think elsewhere he sort of frames it as Christianity, but he uses these almost interchangeably. They're responsible for the largest highest heap of corpses in history. And I think that's something that we see borne out here if we're applying it to this nationalist, fundamentalist version of evangelical Christianity in our conversation today and in the movement that we confront today. And so I want to wrap up with a point from Frederick Douglass, who wrote actually explicitly in response to Willard, remember, who earlier was comparing Black Americans to a biblical plague of locusts. And he essentially, says this is ridiculous and we can't take people like this seriously. He makes a very similar point to the one that Césaire makes about 50 years later, which is, look, like if this is Christianity and if this is civilization, then, this is worse, in fact, than whatever it is that these people are calling savagery. I mean, I think that's the point that I want to end with, which is that we have to sort of call a spade, and we have to stop, I believe, engaging people in good faith who are not themselves engaging in good faith. So I want to thank you for, allowing me to talk at you for a little bit, and I look forward to our discussion.
That was really informative. I jotted down some notes, and we do have some questions coming in from the people who are attending.
Sure.
Kind of makes me, one of the things I thought of, I read a book by Edward Ball, Slaves in the Family, yeah. And he, goes on this journey where, he grew up in South Carolina, the largest, most active port of entry for enslaved people, and
right.
how he went on this journey to try to find folks that he may be related to. And it was just so interesting, him talking to the white family members, and they have this very idyllic remembrance of what slavery was really like. And yeah. They were so benevolent and kind, and they were really good people. And it was funny because the Black people who he figured he was probably related to were very skeptical. And I also remember too how the owners of enslaved people, they really weren't into higher education. They talked quite a bit about how it was almost laughed at, oh, we've got this giant plantation, we don't have to worry about educating. And so there's definitely a parallel there.
Right.
I find it, I've jotted down, at a church or courthouse to give it validity for these lynchings. Yeah. And just, that, again, thinking about the article that you wrote about hypocrisy and how you can't call it out, right? Because this is fascism, so you can't really call it out. Yeah, so those are just some of my observations of your discussion. Let's go ahead and go to the questions. This one comes from Peter, and Peter says, how much of the ideology, and then in parentheses, racism, can be determined to be present in the US in 2022 through polling data? I don't know if you'll be able to answer that, but.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, that's a tricky question. I do actually look at polling data some, but I mean, that's not where I spend most of my time. But I think last time I checked, and this may have changed The Republican Party is 89% white. I think the Democratic Party is 57. This is off the top of my head, and so I may be wrong, but I think those are the most up-to-date numbers. And so again, like, we can see this in sort of like the partisan divide. But, let's think about it in terms of like party ideology, right? Like, I think that's where it starts to make a lot more sense, right? And so when we talk about like, Republican candidates having to like denounce the phrase Black Lives Matter, right? Or to sort of like denounce that, like, reject the idea that Joe Biden or Democrats can like win elections, right? Then these sort of like broader demographic trends kind of do start to align with like this more explicit ideology. There's also a really interesting book, and I, had a chance to read it very carefully, The Flag and the Cross, which takes a look at some of this demographic data. I don't want to butcher it off the top of my head, but it looks explicitly at what it essentially calls white Christian nationalism and the role that it plays in American politics. And so that may be, if you're looking for resources, I think that may be an excellent one.
I find it really alarming that, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, they're just saying the quiet part out loud. Yes, I'm a proud Christian nationalist. Like,
right.
And whenever I go on Twitter, it seems that, atheism is trending quite a bit and Christian nationalism is trending quite a bit. And it feels like people are finally starting to kind of realize the connection here that's really been in front of our very own eyes since the formation of this country, Yeah. We have another question. This one comes from Martha. Martha is actually one of our board members. She asks, I don't know if this is a rhetorical question, would slavery have been so prevalent without capitalism?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think the very short answer is you don't get capitalism without slavery. You also don't get slavery without capitalism. There's a huge sort of like scholarly pile of stuff, I could just sort of hand you. But in lieu of that, I don't want to like jabber endlessly about this, but it's something I think about a lot. And I think when we talk about not only Black Americans, but also like sort of the U.S.'s response to like indigenous nations, for instance, we think about the sort of the ongoing issues like with both of these like marginalized, oppressed, expropriated groups. When we talk about migrant workers, right, we are really talking about different expressions of a sort of the same larger system that is designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. That's capitalism, right? And so if you were to look at that lynching map that I showed a while ago, right, you would see like, in some areas, there just are not really Black Americans, in the period that it's looking at. And in fact, like the vast majority of like, agricultural workers, and this is really who is most targeted, by lynchings, are Chinese migrants, are Mexican migrants, and so, yeah, I mean, if I think looking at it as this sort of like broader system that can be applied in many ways, but to produce this main outcome of property and power is probably the way to go. I meant to not talk a lot, but then I did. Sorry.
No, you're fine. And I mean, it really, you said something too about, demonic influences. And so our organization is very, myself as an individual or our organization in general, we've been doing these candidate forums. And essentially, if you are part of the new Trump GOP, you won't participate in those. And in fact, one of the participants of one of our school board candidate forums, she reached out to me to let me know that she has been censured by her legislative district, by the board, because she participated. She's a moderate Republican. She participated in our event, and then she was essentially called a member of a satanic cult or whatever. And so she's, as a precinct committee person, she's no longer allowed to have any kind of voice or say so in the party. So It's,
Wow.
and then also with the CRT stuff, which is, bananas out here. We have,
Yeah.
really radical extremist people who are running for school board, who are already in our legislature. We have folks who participated in the insurrection.
Yeah.
And then, our state superintendent, one of the candidates, all his signs say, whenever you drive around the Phoenix metropolitan area, is stop CRT. And these people do seem to kind of, it's so important to learn this history, and it's just so strange for educators, people who are running for that type of office, to want to actually, quiet any kind of critical thought. Can't talk about race at all. Yeah. Peter, I think this is more of a comment than a question, but Peter says the PBS documentary, Ken Burns, my favorite documentarian, the PBS documentary on the Holocaust includes deep-seated anti-Semitism, similar to anti-Black ideology among many whites. Yes, and I feel like Ken Burns too also doesn't necessarily insert, he just lets the primary documents speak for themselves, which is why I love him. But I felt like this time around he was making a statement, especially in light of, what Governor DeSantis has done in Florida and Abbott in Texas with the busing of these people. And I was really surprised to see that even after the American people really understood what was happening in Hitler's, Germany and the countries that, that 5%, the end of World War II, there was still only 5% of American people who approved of allowing folks who were seeking asylum from, regimes. Here's another one. This one comes from Deborah. Deborah says, in response to one of your reflection questions, I think that tragically white evangelical / nationalist Christianity promotes ideologies and behaviors that are polar opposite to Jesus's teaching. I think that it provides community comfort and cover to people who fear and are encouraged to hate and dehumanize and harm those who are different. I'm not a religious person, obviously. I think of the King Missile song, Jesus was way cool. I don't know if you're familiar with it. If you're not, look it up on YouTube. But if you take a look at the stories of Jesus, you think here's a guy, who would absolutely be targeted now by the folks in the GOP who claim to be Christians. I don't know if you want to speak about that at all, but I'd love to hear your commentary.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible irony, I think, and just very distressing, to have this movement ostensibly based on someone who was persecuted by the state violence, of an empire, as an ethnic minority. I mean, this is a laughable concept, as a basis for a system of oppression, and yet it is one, right? And it's incredibly distressing. But I think also in some ways it maybe is a reminder, right? Like there was, and I have a little bit of a background, like some of my early graduate work was in church history. And, there was like a big debate, in the 4th century over whether or not to sort of allow like a state sponsored religion and, to participate in that as a Christian community. And so some thinkers call that the Constantinian heresy, this idea that like, the church kind of sold out when it wielded state violence. But I mean, you can sort of see like embedded in Christian practice, this idea, especially in evangelical communities, that like, it's really bad to not have power because look what happened to that guy, right? But it is, I mean, the level of cognitive dissonance is such that I don't even think it, is useful to call, hypocrites or, these terms, right? Because it's obvious, there's obviously something else going on there.
This one again is another comment from Deborah. She says, regrettably, they have been accepted and are profitable and successful. Oh my gosh, yeah. We had Hemant Mehta on about last month sometime, I think. And, on Twitter, he's the Friendly Atheist, and he often shares these church sermons where people are not just proselytizing, but then also encouraging their members to vote a certain way, to support a specific party. So yeah, that just kind of speaks to that. Oh, somebody's got their hand up. Let me see. one second. Let me get to this other question first, Jeannie, because I don't know if it's Jean or Jeannie. But she has a question here in the chat that says, how organized are the white Christians, i.e. from the top down? So that's part one. And also, was there opposition to white supremacy, lynching, etc., from deists who don't call themselves Christians, e.g. Catholics, Quakers, and Mormons? So go ahead and answer that.
Sure. There is some anti-lynching sentiment from Catholics. That's in part because, by the turn of the 20th century, they're also targets. The Klan targeted Catholics, Jews, and anyone they considered non-Anglo-Saxon. And obviously that has morphed over time, what they mean by that. And so there are some reasons for that. There's also sort of like, this pretty consistent sanctity of life positioning, right? And so the Catholic Church, for instance, opposes the death penalty for sort of similar reasons. They opposed eugenics for sort of similar set of reasons, right? There were also like prominent Catholic, advocates of lynching, so this isn't like, a broad brush here, but I think, there are those currents that resisted lynching as well. The same with Quakers and other sort of like classic dissenting denominations.
So Jeannie, I'm going to allow you to speak because your hand is still up. Did that answer your question, or did you? Well, Jeannie's dog definitely has something to say. Oh, wait, that's your dog. Okay, so I think she's good. Wait, Jeannie, is it Jean or Jeannie?
It's Jean.
Okay.
Okay. The first question about the Christians, I've always wondered how organized they were. I mean, like, they have, it was this, and it doesn't continue to be an individual thing. I know the Baptists, I think, are very, very well organized. The white Baptists are, but in other religions, in other Christian religions, were they kind of organized in being like basically white supremacists from long back, and in terms of the structure, their hierarchy within their churches, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that, unfortunately, is yes. And so most of these Christian denominations have their own, like, what they call synods, like meetings, basically, of all of their like pastors or priests or ministers. They're sort of most important members, right? And they do come out with statements about lynching, often sort of failing to condemn them, but at the ground level, pastors and ministers were like often participants in lynching events, and so I think that's really where you see that play out more clearly, and you also see that now, right? Like that that has been accelerated, I think, by social media. Also by the advent of sort of national media. It's kind of hard to compare, honestly, because during Jim Crow, like, our media was hyper local, and politics was hyper local in a way that it isn't anymore. And so if you don't deny the President Biden is president, right, in Pennsylvania, you pretty much can't run as a Republican. That's also true in Arizona, right? Very different places, very different constituencies, and yet, right, we have this sort of like national political consciousness now in a way that we didn't as much, before.
So, we're approaching the end of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but it all kind of seems hopeless. And so I'm curious, especially, given the article that I started to read earlier today, where it doesn't, you say basically you can't point out hypocrisy because this is fascism. So, and I know I've lost family members since 2016, 2015, right, to that ideology. And I know that probably a lot of our members and attendees today have also experienced that. So, like, is there anything that we can actually do to, bring some kind of understanding, or is it, we just don't waste our time on these folks, or like, what do we do?
I think they're committed to something that we're not going to be able to convince them not to be committed to. yeah, I think, you know, I was on a podcast recently and someone asked me like, you know, I don't know, like, what do you say to Trump voters? And it was just, I'm very nothing. Like, I don't have anything to say, you know, and maybe, you know, maybe these things can change like within that community, I guess. But, you know, as far as I can tell, you know, today's Republican Party is not committed to the things that they even sort of like very broadly say that they are committed to, which is not much. You know, this is a pretty clearly a fascist movement, you know, and that's, you know, deeply disturbing. But it also, I think, knowing that gives us the opportunity to organize, you know, and to respond without trying to go back and forth with people who are not, you know, don't, I mean, like, if I'm a demonic influence, like, I'm not going to, right? Like, I can't have a conversation with you, you know, and unfortunately, like, I guess I've been a demonic influence before, right? You know, I've also lost family members to this movement, and it's unfortunate and deeply frustrating. Yeah, I do think there are reasons for hope. Unfortunately, we are also just sitting, you know, at the crossroads of like several like massive crises. You know, the climate is maybe sort of the biggest accelerant out of all of these. And so there is increasingly a scarcity of resources issue that is very closely tied to racist violence historically. You know, so I think if I'm thinking about like sort of how we respond, it's in organizing some sort of like social safety net type of stuff, right? And in organizing communities of care.
Well, and I guess that's why we do the work that we do here,
Yeah,
to try to
right.
combat this at every level. And gratefully, we have members who are really active in trying to combat the rising trend of Christian nationalists. Like I said, we have elected officials at the congressional level, at the legislative level. We have people running for state offices here in Arizona who fully embrace these conspiracy theories, white Christian nationalism. I mean, so you know, that's all we can do, right? If it's election cycle, got to knock doors, got to call people, got to make sure that, you know, those folks who maybe haven't been engaged before will be engaged in November. But wow, this, Will, has been such a great conversation. Is there anything that you'd like to promote at all? You know, if you've got anything that it's coming out, a book or anything that you're doing so folks can support the work that you do?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. You can follow me on Twitter. I just sort of think about these things out loud sometimes on Twitter. I have a Substack. I'm gonna have some more stuff coming out on that, sort of promoting like utopian and, you know, mutual aid sort of thinking. So that's In Case of Emergency is the name of the Substack. And I'll have some articles coming out that I'm going to sort of like filter through there, so everyone can have access to them.
Great. So yeah, I put all those links on our Facebook. So if you want to follow Will on Twitter, if you want to subscribe to his Substack, by all means, check out the link. And we are just really grateful for you taking time out of your very busy schedule, and for everybody else who was able to come today. I hope everybody has a really great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye. Thanks.